But I will say you know, as I spoke of earlier, when you look at raising the tax on anything, you need to look at what is happening around you to determine what are going to be the impacts of that in a kind of in a dynamic sense. And when Florida raised theirs up over a dollar, it has had some impact on their border cities. So, you know, maybe there's a number that people are more comfortable with that brings you in line with all the neighboring states. But again, that's not. I mean, we're looking at on the reducing spending side. We have not been looking on the revenue side. So there has not been a serious discussion in the Senate over raising any tax.
The question, I guess, then becomes, based on what you just said, is are we at a point where if you look at the impact of further cuts, it's almost as bad, if not worse, than raising revenue? I mean, are we getting, in some services that people depend on, to the point where cutting those would make it just as bad as raising the revenue?
That's a legitimate question, Dennis, and I think you're probably getting to the point where you do have to weigh those concerns. I think in the past, when the budget was growing 6, 7, 8% a year, you look at it and you say, obviously, under no circumstances would an additional dollar of revenue be worth the cut. But there are some who are looking at it and saying, is that cut going to cause more than a dollar's worth of harm to the state of Georgia? I don't know the answer to that, but I think part of the equation that we often don't look at is that what is this doing, this additional revenue doing to the people who are having to pay it? And, you know, it's easy to say, well, just put it on cigarettes and someone will pay it, they ought not to be smoking. And I think if you look at the polling data, it always seems to reflect almost exactly that the percentage of people for raising the tax is the exact same percentage of people who don't smoke. And I don't smoke and never have and hopefully never will. But you have to look at what is the long-term implications of this. Does it raise that amount of money? I know in New Jersey they raised cigarette taxes back-to-back years, and I think in the second year they actually got less revenue. So you have to take all this into consideration. It's not just as easy as saying, pass a buck and it raises $350 million.
Well, part of the reason is to dissuade people from smoking. You decrease the number of people paying.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about it. And what does that do to your health care costs long term? Is there a positive impact there? I think one problem you get into when you raise it so much higher than your neighboring states is then you have the black market. Then you have, of course, the cross-state purchases. I read and you have substitute products. And I think this is something to keep in mind, and I would have never believed it, but I read a recent edition of Reason magazine where they said in those states where cigarette taxes went dramatically high, young people started turning to marijuana more often. So, I mean, you do have to consider what are the substitutes to cigarettes and whether they be good or bad.
Do you have this philosophy of fee versus tax? If we call this a cigarette user fee, would there be a difference? I'm just curious, you know, it's like, is it tax a fee?
I think you could probably make that argument if the revenue generated from the cigarette fee, as you call it, were going directly to healthcare costs. When it just goes into the general fund, I don't think that it's logical to call it that.
Well, wouldn't we use them for Medicaid and pull down the federal funds?
Well, I mean, it would require a constitutional amendment to separate that money. But getting back to fees, I think that, you know, as we're all taxpayers, if somebody's availing themselves of some sort of government service and they're not paying at least the cost to provide that service, then the rest of us are having to pay the tab. So, on the fee structure side, I think that you have to at least expect the person to pay the cost to cover the service being provided. And I don't know that anyone has a philosophical problem with that. So that's the area we're looking at. And you have, again, some of these fees that haven't been raised since the 1960s.
So a number of times you've spoken of you and other legislative leaders talked about the structural changes in state government and reducing the workforce would be one example of a structural change. But now you've had 2 weeks off on this break, and a lot of taxpayers in the state are wondering what changes they can expect from the budget collapse. So what are those structural changes that people would notice?
Well, one thing we have learned during these 2 weeks is that some of the structural changes are going to be very difficult and take some time, that it's going to extend beyond this session. And I'll give you an example. We need to look at all of these departments and are there shared services that can help them run more efficiently and at a lower cost. I mean, do we really need administrative services for payroll and those type things for every department in state government? So we've got to begin looking at ways to combine that. And when you do that, you can't really do it in 2 weeks. You know, if there was some real low-hanging fruit out there where we could do it in 2 weeks, we certainly would. But I don't know that that's possible. But I think everyone is now committed to finding those areas where you can bring departments together, and at least on the backside of government, the clerical work, the administrative work, have one unit that all those departments share. And I think you will, number one, reduce the number of state employees, number two, reduce a whole lot of cost and increase efficiency. But it's more difficult than we originally thought.
Well, one of the things that you have kept saying is that you need to grow the economy rather than
Right.
raise taxes. So what are y'all doing that that can have an impact in a very short time span?
Well, the first thing we're doing is rejecting these, what seem to be endless calls for tax increases. Again, tax increases are stopgap measures for the most part that will get you some immediate revenue, but probably do more harm over the long term than they do good. And so we need to reject those. The second thing I think we need to do, and we have had some pretty frank discussions with the House on this, and they seem to be in agreement, is look at major tax reform. And I don't hold out any hope of that happening this session. But when you get in these times and people begin to look at how our revenue is coming in and what is our tax structure, and can we have a tax structure that doesn't have these wild swings in it by maybe having some major reform, I think there's a commitment on both sides to begin looking at that. And I think you'll probably see something come out of the General Assembly this session that puts that process in motion. Because a lot of decisions that these companies make when they're looking at states dealing, whether it be taxation or regulation, litigation factors, I mean, these are the things that they look at. And the Georgia Department of Economic Development tells us they've had a record year of companies looking at the state of Georgia. Well, we got to close those deals, and one of the ways you close those deals is making the state far more business friendly than it ever has been. We've got time for like a couple more.
What about the university system, that those cuts or potential cuts have certainly gotten a lot of play, even some anger out of the governor the other day. What's your take on that whole situation?
Well, I think there's been some misinformation out there. I think if you look at what is actually proposed, what is in the budget, not requests by legislators, but actually what is in the budget, what's on the table, you're looking at a reduction in the Board of Regents that brings them back to almost fiscal year 2006 spending levels. Well, the state as a whole is back at fiscal year 2003 spending levels. So if you look at the impact on the Board of Regents over the last few years, if you take the increases from 2004, 2005, 2006, they almost offset what you're looking at as far as reductions are concerned now. And the way we know that's for certain is a percentage of the budget that goes to Board of Regents has actually increased over the last 8 years. So they're getting a larger portion of the pie. Problem is the pie is shrinking. So we have done a lot of work over the last few years to ensure that the Board of Regents is not being dramatically reduced. They are, just like every other department in government, going to have a significant reduction this year, but I don't think it's anywhere in line with some of the figures that have been discussed.
Senator Preston Smith has said he wants to see conflict case funding go to the counties instead of having the state handle it. Is that something that's going to change this year?
I think so. Senator Smith's done a lot of work in that area, and I think he's got a good plan. Look, a few years ago when in special session we created this funding mechanism for this indigent defense. Everybody had the best of intentions, but it has not worked out very well. It has become a serious economic issue for the state, a funding issue that we really need to return back to the local governments and let the counties do it. I know at that time a few counties asked for waivers, including both of my counties, and they were given waivers. I think it's just a testament that certain counties can do this a lot better than the state can do it. And I think that local government, us supporting local government in that manner and giving them the resources back so that they can handle it themselves is probably the best thing to do.
One quick thought, you said you didn't see any hope for major tax reform this session. Does that mean the business bills to encourage businesses to hire
No,
the unemployed and
no,
to
we're
give the brakes on fees? I mean,
yeah,
where's that stand?
I think that, well, I haven't talked to Representative Graves about that in a couple of weeks, but he was very positive that was going to move through. I wouldn't put that in the category of major structural change to our tax code in Georgia, which I think is probably what we need.
Would it include your property tax?
Yeah, that's moving along quickly. That should be on the floor hopefully this week. And that's not structural tax change. That is fixing the assessment and appeals process. But
Still talking about dropping the inventory taxes?
well, the state inventory tax, of course, as you know, is on the ballot this year to remove the state portion, which of course is just that $250,000. But it does do a lot for economic development in that it removes us from the list of states that has a statewide inventory tax. But we are certainly looking at the inventory tax going forward. That is one of the most anti-business taxes we have, and I think that's when we talk about structural tax change, that's one of the ones we absolutely must address, because there's far more damage done by the inventory tax in Georgia than revenue raised. Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir.